Hello and welcome to this Child Welfare Capacity Building Center for States Total Cost of Ownership Toolkit webinar. Today's call is being recorded. Before we begin, I'd like to turn the conference over to Ms. Christy Stankovich. Please go ahead.
Thank you again. Good afternoon. As the operator just mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. This webinar is also interactive and will feature several polling questions. Attendees may ask questions through the question and answer pod on the right-hand side of the Adobe Connect screen. You'll also find a resources pod on your right-hand side as well. Phone lines will be muted throughout the presentation. At this time, I'd like to turn the call over to Kate McElroy-Hjelm of the Capacity Building Center for States. And this is Christy Stankovich. I will continue with the presentation while we wait for Kate to jump back on. Today we'll go over through the agenda, starting with introductions and the Center for States overview. Next, the introduction and total cost of ownership, development approach, overviews and examples of costs, followed by the key considerations for jurisdictions, the toolkit review, and then finally the questions and closing. I'd like to introduce Kate McElroy-Hjelm, the data specialist for the Center for States, Michelle Pryor, who is a consultant for the Center for States, as well as Gita Manis and Tressa Young of the Children's Bureau. The purpose of today's call, the Capacity Building Center for States supports to serve public child welfare agencies in efforts to effectively initiate and sustain change and innovation, resulting in improved system, organizational, and program performance. Before we begin the presentation, we wanted to provide some background on the Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative and the Center for States. In October of 2014, ICF was awarded a contract by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administrating for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, to establish the new Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative. The Center for States, the Center for Tribes, and the Center for Courts are partners who form the Capacity Building Collaborative that consolidates services that have been previously provided by the National Child Welfare Resource Centers. This consolidation increases coordination, leverages resources, and provides more strategic service provision. And I'll pause for just a second to see if we've got Kate back on the line.
Hi, Christy. It's Kate. Thanks so much. Sorry about that. I just totally got dropped off the line, so thanks for taking over those slides. I'll just pick up where you left off, and then maybe once we get a little further, we'll go back to the introductions. Great. So the collaborative, I'm sorry, I should back up. This is Kate McElroy-Hjelm with the Center for States, and thanks so much for joining us today. I apologize for that little technical glitch. So we're just going to go ahead and continue with these slides about the center and the collaborative. So our goals are to work with partners and jurisdictions to support capacity building to lead to improved outcomes for children and families. And we do this by partnering with states, territories, tribes, and courts to identify, design, and implement innovative solutions that meet the unique needs of each jurisdiction. The Center for States serves state and territorial public child welfare agencies and Title 40 waiver demonstration jurisdictions. ICF International supports the Center for States, where Maggie Bishop is the project director. And you might recognize ICF from our work with the Child Welfare Information Gateway, as ICF has a long history of working on technical assistance contracts with the Children's Bureau and our other government agencies. The Center for States aims to provide evidence-based capacity building support services that will improve performance and support states and territories in effectively initiating, implementing, and sustaining change and innovation. To achieve this goal, we work with our partners to create and deliver coordinated, inclusive, and well-informed capacity building services. The Center for States is designed to support the Children's Bureau vision of providing strategic evidence-informed services to build the capacity of state and territorial public child welfare agencies. Our goals are to improve system, organizational, and program performance, significantly enhance safety, permanency, and well-being of children, youth, and families, and use an evidence-based approach and consolidated capacity building services for child welfare. So as I mentioned, my name is Kate McElroy-Hjelm, and I am a data specialist with the Center for States and also the priority area agenda lead for child welfare information systems. And I started with the center in January 2015 as a state liaison for the center, and when the data team expanded, I transitioned over to my current role. And before joining the center, I was with the National Resource Center for Child Welfare Data and Technology for about 10 years. Michelle Pryor is a consultant with the Center for States and has developed most of the content that you'll be seeing and hearing about today. She has more than 25 years experience consulting with child welfare and other health and human services agencies across the country. Her experience in child welfare includes information system development, practice model implementation, revenue enhancement, program compliance, and project management. And she was previously a consultant with the Mountains and Plains Child Welfare Implementation Center and led the State of New Mexico Pinion Project for that center. And we also want to acknowledge our Children's Bureau Division of State Systems partners and FPOs that are on the line with us today, Gita Manis and Teresa Young, and they're great assets to the center's work around supporting states in their efforts to develop effective child welfare information systems. So we wanted to thank them for being here today. The objective for the webinar today is to understand the basics of total cost of ownership, which we'll be referring to as TCO throughout the webinar, and considerations related to development approaches and examples of information system costs. You'll also see a sample TCO workbook that jurisdictions can use to capture cost estimates over a multi-year period. And this is a tool that the Center for States has just recently put out on the website. We've provided it in the resources on your Adobe pod called Total Cost of Ownership Guide and Calculator. And you'll be seeing a live demo of that today after we go through some of the presentation. And at the end of the webinar, we'll give you some more information on where to go with any additional questions. We've also posted in the resources where you can find your Center for States liaison, who's the one that works directly with each state to coordinate services, and then also the state and tribal assignments for the Children's Bureau Division of State Systems analysts. Okay, so with that, let's get back to the topic at hand, and we'll briefly go over the webinar objectives more specifically. So we're going to identify information about system readiness and planning considerations, review development phases and the system development life cycle, learn and test knowledge about key considerations for implementing a child welfare information system. And notice we said test knowledge. We're going to include some pop quizzes throughout the webinar to test your knowledge and to see if there's any areas where we can kind of provide some more clarification. We're going to review the variety of costs that agencies could use in a TCO analysis. And finally, as I mentioned, we're going to view a demonstration of how to use the TCO workbook. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Pryor.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone. So what is total cost of ownership and why do one? So child welfare systems are critical tools for child welfare agencies at whatever level, at a state, tribe, county level, at any agency level, and useful for supporting the casework that you do, tracking service delivery, and tracking programs. Child welfare systems should also improve processes, improve operational efficiency, and ideally achieve end-user satisfaction. In addition, child welfare systems are needed to collect the data that jurisdictions need to report, to aggregate that data for federal reporting, and to support outcomes measurements and quality effectiveness of programs. So as a jurisdiction contemplates how their data and operational needs can be met by a child welfare information system, and you consider your options that are available in the marketplace, it's important to calculate and consider the total cost of ownership. So the next slide. What is the total cost of ownership? It's a comprehensive analysis and financial estimate, including direct costs and indirect costs that are associated with purchasing, using, and retiring an information system. So you're looking at, and we'll get into some more examples and detailed examples of those costs, and you'll see them aggregated on a workbook. But in a total cost of ownership, you should consider hardware and software acquisition costs. So what does it cost to actually acquire the solution you're going to use? the management and support that's needed. So that could be management through an external TMO vendor. It could be support services from hosting services and IT support. It should include end user expenses, of which there are many, and training expenses, obviously, for end users and ongoing training over the life of that system, as well as the cost of moving data from an old system to a new system. And it could be not just one old legacy system, but many. So that data migration cost. The total cost of ownership can extend over any period of time. 3 years, 5 years, 10 years are kind of common terms, but it can be over the life of that information system. So what I have created for today is a 5-year sort of 5-year TCO. A jurisdiction can use any duration of time that they want. But you're really looking at the cost of not just the development side, but also the ongoing maintenance as the solution runs, as it's upgraded, as changes come along, and what the costs are to maintain that system in its active use. Now we can go to the next slide. So who should contribute to a total cost of ownership? People who have an active role in using a child welfare information system, obviously people that understand information technology costs, program leadership, budget and finance staff, and other stakeholders. So people that are familiar with the various costs that might go into an IT system should contribute to the total cost of ownership. It's not ideal that one person speculates on what the hosting charge might be for their application, or one person guesses at a licensing fee for help desk support. So we would recommend that IT staff, program staff, budget and finance staff, and other folks really inform that TCO. Okay, next slide. First question is pretty easy. A TCO, this is a true or false question. A TCO is best completed by a single individual without input from others. So please enter your answers. Pretty much, I think everyone's got that right. Ideally, not done by a single person, ideally done and informed by others, at least with input. Doesn't necessarily need to have 10 owners, but it certainly should have as many contributors as have some perspective on the information system itself. So thank you. The next thing we're going to talk about in the next several slides are development approaches. So we talk about different development approaches that are used to develop a system development lifecycle and the phases that software development implementations go through, and then we'll have a few slides on cloud versus on-premises hosting. They're included in this, the different approaches and the system development lifecycle are included in this TCO because the choice that a jurisdiction might make on development approach will drive the cost in each phase of the system. And those costs should be included in the TCO itself. The slide is pretty dense, but it talks about the two major methods, the waterfall method and the agile method. We'll get into each of those in specific detail. And I do want to sort of point out that the project timeline, so requirements change, customers turn over, and technology innovates over the life of a project. So as you're looking at planning and analyzing your requirements, those can change when you're 2 years into your effort. Your customer could change, technology could innovate, and therefore your approach might need to adjust to that technology. So whatever approach someone takes, just know that those factors and those inputs will be impacting the project over its life cycle. Next slide, please. This is a high-level overview of the waterfall method, which, just like it looks, one phase is done in a sequence with one phase being completed before another phase begins. So requirements are gathered, analysis is completed, and then you get to coding the system and testing the system. In the waterfall approach, there's extensive time allocated for analysis and requirements gathering, and for the design, build, and testing before it's actually deployed and implemented, and then it goes into maintenance. The waterfall method works best when clients can articulate a clear vision for the final product and the final information system. So now we'll contrast that to the agile method on the next slide. Agile development involves a series of iterations or sprints that can vary from a few weeks to a few months. And during those sprints, predetermined features are developed and delivered. So on this slide, you'll see, reading from the left, develop functionality, there's a number 1. So you're developing the functionality, you're integrating and testing, and then you're developing another bit of functionality. And so there's a series of those sprints where you're developing predetermined features. We have at the very top of the circle develop functionality N, so there's N number of, any number of times you might be going through these sprints. But you're developing features, and then you're releasing those features. Then we're coming down the right side of the circle. As you're releasing that functionality to a customer, the customer might have feedback that they want to have changes made. You might go back in now and tweak the system and make those changes and test. The agile development is only done when all the functionalities are complete. If the functionalities are not complete, you'll do another iteration. So the development approach in agile does an analysis, design, and build cycle multiple times over. In the waterfall method, development and build is one long phase, but it has a beginning and an end, and then it moves into deployment and release. So there's just a difference in that. Waterfall is over time. Agile has a series of iterations, and Agile works best when there's probably not a clear vision of what the final product should be, so a state wants to see and make changes on the fly. The next slide, we'll introduce the concept of system development lifecycle. So I'm just going to read the very top, and we'll talk a bit about this on the next several slides. But the SDLC is the process used to develop an information system, including requirements definition, requirements validation, training, and user ownership and deployment of the system. Next slide, we'll talk about the more discrete phases. So previously, a few slides back, we showed waterfall, agile, but we talked about requirements gathering, design, building, testing, and implementation in a very linear way. This just shows it in more of a circular way because truly one feeds the other. And specifically, when you're talking about a system development lifecycle, the requirements and analysis phase is the phase in which you're gathering requirements and developing requirement specifications. So what does the system need to do? What do we want to specify about the expected outcomes of the system? That's a very extensive effort in either waterfall or the agile method, but what the system needs to do is the requirements and writing those down as a specification document. The specification document then feeds the next stage, which is your system analysis and design, where you're actually designing the system architecture and the software based on the requirements that were developed in the first phase. Then you move into coding and testing, where you actually organize the work, code the system, and then test the developed code against those requirements and see how well you did. So did the testing actually achieve the outcome that the requirement thought it would? At the point at which testing is complete and you're satisfied that you've actually met the objectives of the requirements, you would then implement. So that's similar to deploying the system. You deliver the system to the customer. You might find bugs during that phase and that you need to fix after that system is deployed. So implementation then moves into the maintenance mode. And during the maintenance mode, you're looking at system performance. So the speed of the system, uptime, downtime, response time. You might be installing fixes for bugs and defects. You're updating system components. So the maintenance phase lasts through, that's the useful life that you might extend that system over, is it 5, 10, 20 years. But once you go through the development, design, and implementation phases, you're in a long stage of maintenance whereby components can change, requirements can change, or bugs and things need to be fixed. But next, we have another polling question. So true or false again, waterfall development is organized into sprints or iterations. All right, pretty overwhelmingly correct group again. Absolutely, waterfall is not when you're doing sprints and iterations, that would be agile. So that answer is false. Thank you. Go on to the next slide. So at the beginning of this section, we talked about that we would be discussing development approaches, which we just did, waterfall and agile, the system development lifecycle, and then we have a few slides on on-premises versus in the cloud. And you hear a lot about in the cloud and what does that mean. Child welfare systems need infrastructure to operate. So systems operate on servers, on platforms, and the infrastructure or the tools that are put in place to run that application, store the data, provide backup and recovery. And those services can operate on the premises or in the cloud. So on-premises, which is the house, normally requires the setup and operation of a data center within the organization. So it could be within a DCF agency, or it could be in a partner organization. So it could be in a jurisdiction's information technology division or administrative services. But it truly is, there's the server room, there's the data center, that's where our database administrator sits, There's a lot of cost involved in buying the servers and the hardware and the equipment to fit out that room, to equip that room, but that's the on-premises approach. In contrast, cloud hosting and cloud solutions are normally accessed through the internet. Clients pay a fee to another entity to provide and maintain that infrastructure off-site. Fees for cloud computing are really on a pay-as-you-go basis or a demand basis, so the size of the data or the number of hours of use that you need might drive the cloud-based. So the next slide we'll talk about just contrasting a bit from on-premises to cloud. So we talked about it's in the jurisdiction or it's not. It's a capital expense to establish and equip and outfit the actual rooms themselves versus an operating expense. It's a fixed fee that you negotiate with your vendor. If you're in-house, you can actually control the data connectivity and speed. You can control when you install upgrades, but the implementation might be longer since there's this build-out and establishing sort of exercise. By contrast, on the cloud side, you don't get to control how fast your data gets delivered to you. You don't control when your hardware might get upgraded, but you can access those services a lot more quickly. So the simple analogy of cloud versus on-premises is buying versus renting. So we have another polling question. Another true or false. Cloud hosting is an operating expense that's fee-based and not a capital expense. Okay, absolutely true. Cloud hosting is operations, 100%, that's the right answer. Thanks, everyone. So that sort of finishes the overview of development approaches, development life cycles. Now we're going to get a bit more into costs that go into a total cost of ownership exercise, total cost of ownership calculation. So in the TCO, you should have cost categories that probably should include software, hardware, personnel, network and communications, facilities, and project office. So a facility, we talked about a facility could be your hosting facility, but there also might need to be a project office that you or a vendor works out of. It could be the facilities of just your backup and recovery facility. So all of those costs, and again, if you're doing in the cloud hosting, that cost of accessing that facility is a cost you should include, whether it's your building or someone else's building. The support that you need to access for your system to actually operate should be included in your cost. We talked about this earlier. It can be spread across different phases of the project in different fiscal years. So we talked about in the system development lifecycle that the design, development, implementation phases could be quick iterations, could be longer waterfall, could be multi-year phases. And then you move into the maintenance and operation phase after you've deployed the system. And then obviously there's cost to change, upgrade the system, and change out components. So your total cost should be spread across different years, but obviously some costs you'll experience early in the process and some costs you'll experience later. So we just make a note that year one in the TCO should include your agency readiness activities to the extent that you're going to perform them. Some of them might bleed into year two, but ideally those costs should go in year one. Next slide. You want to make sure that looking at a TCO, you're looking at help desk support costs. We talked already about hosting and other operational support costs. So when you're thinking, it's easy to think about the big bang cost of potentially a big custom implementation or even an off-the-shelf solution. And all these costs are going to be in the first few years of the project when we're actually building the solution. But as you're maintaining that solution, and it's installed and running, there's costs for the help desk when the server goes down. There's scheduled maintenance, so XYZ system will be offline overnight while we perform ongoing maintenance. Or you need to call the help desk to reset your password, or you need to call the help desk to help get a new user provision. So a new staff member started, how do we get them logged on? So there's a lot of costs and support staff that help to keep the system maintaining and up and live and having users be active. We also want to make a note that these costs should look at things that might actually increase over time. So you should include benefit costs for salary staff. You should look at ongoing salary adjustments for staff if you could expect that. So cost of living increases potentially, or increasing costs as they relate to licenses and hosting fees. Or if you're having a hosting chargeback from an information technology department, what is that cost? Can you expect a cost and license costs and fees to increase by 2% or 5% year over year. And if you can, you should demonstrate that in your TCO for however long you're choosing to do it. So the next several slides, we're going to talk a bit about various categories. The categories themselves are organized to reflect the cost you might expect to acquire the tools that you need, so the hardware and the software, to ensure the appropriate personnel are in place and involved in the development and the maintenance of the project, to set up the facilities and the utilities that support the system, and then to maintain the appropriate environments and maintain the solution while it's operational. So we have a series of categories: software costs, licenses, warranties, maintenance contracts, hardware costs, those actual hard physical assets like servers, laptops, tablets, or storage capacity, or a workstation for your database administrator to sit in front of. You have personnel costs. You have internal personnel costs, program staff, subject matter experts, testers, trainers. You have system administrator staff that might not be on the program side, but network administrators, help desk we talked about, programmers. You might have contracts, legal staff, policy staff. So there's a series of personnel costs within the jurisdiction that you need to be thoughtful and consider as you're looking at your total cost. Last few categories: network and communication we talked a lot about already. The hosting side, what kind of network do you have? Do you have Wi-Fi? Do you have wires? What environment are you using? What network software do you need to maintain your environments or to maintain your networks to be operational? And then facilities we've already discussed to a large degree as well. So those are some of the examples of costs that you might see in your TCO. And the next slide is a multiple choice question. So which of these costs below is not a hardware or software cost? Yep. Okay, everybody, you got it right. The project office rent, that would be on a facilities type cost, but not a hardware or a software cost. Okay. So now we're going to introduce some of the items that we're going to have and some additional considerations for states, and then we're going to dive into the actual workbook itself. So if you're the user and the keeper of a TCO, you can decide what your year is. So we talked about it can go 3, 5, 10 years, X number of years. Whether your year starts at the calendar year, the fiscal year, the federal fiscal year, you can decide what a year looks like and what your duration is. If you're trying to quantify the cost of internal personnel, you can use an assumption or an estimate of 2,080 hours per FTE, and then half time would be 1,040 hours. You can decide how you want to capture costs. The last couple of points are important. Jurisdictions should have an estimate of the number of end users of the system. So some of that planning work that we talked about earlier, so it might just not just be requirements and what do we want the system to do, but truly how many people will use this system. So the number of users that you have might drive how many people need to be trained, or how many different PCs, laptops, or tablets need to be purchased. Or if you're buying software that has a seat license, so every user must have a license, how many licenses do you need to acquire? Now, it's not as if you have to buy all of your laptops the first year, and it's not as if you can't buy additional licenses if your agency expands, or if your number of end users grows because you extend the functionality to a sister agency. But starting out with an understanding of how many users do I have, what do I need to sort of have for them to work off of, what's the actual equipment they'll use, how many people do I need to train? Those are important to have early on when you're looking at completing your TCO. Right up front, we talked about this sort of as early on phases, but you may wish to or need to modify or re-engineer business processes before you're doing your information technology implementation, ideally. So if there's a business process that you want to re-engineer and you want to involve multiple stakeholders in remapping your business processes, ideally, you should try to do that before the technology changes, because perhaps you want to build workflows into your solution that supports that business process. So we would recommend that the idea of which processes do we want to revisit and re-engineer, that work should probably be done earlier on, either before you start the TCO or very early in the requirements and design gathering phase of the process. Some other overarching things for jurisdictions to consider: federal guidance, funding, and development approach. So federal guidance encourages system development that promotes data sharing and interoperability, including components and features and modules that can be reused by the jurisdiction. So thinking about child welfare information systems, what are some of the features that a jurisdiction can use that would support data sharing, interoperability, and modularity? We see that a lot in some of the federal guidance that's coming out. It's been that way in the Medicaid information technology for years. So that's a consideration. Funding. So the funding that you need, whether it be state funding or federal funding, that needs to be secured before you undertake the system acquisition or development effort. I think that seems obvious, but it's not included in the TCO itself, like the cost of writing an APD. I don't have necessarily in the version you're going to see, you won't see a placeholder for that, but certainly that's a planning cost that a jurisdiction could look at. And then the development approach, that waterfall versus agile. Depending on which approach you take, the level of staff resources, of internal staff resources that you need that are dedicated to the system will really ebb and flow based on the development approach that you have. So if it's waterfall with a huge amount of effort during requirements analysis and design, then you might have a lot of subject matter experts and program staff really front-loaded on the project, and then they can peel off and go back to their day jobs. If you do the agile approach, you may need to have a smaller team, but a team that can cycle through multiple iterations over the course of the project life. So those considerations around what does your staffing model look like, what resources does the approach actually, which resources are impacted depending on the approach that we need. Just wanted to point out that those are not the only considerations, but they're important ones. So the next thing I'm going to do is do a quick orientation to what you're going to see in the toolkit. Then we're going to do a short demo of some of the costs that we captured in a pretend information system acquisition. A few notes before we go. The example presented is a 5-year TCO. As we've said multiple times, yours could be shorter or longer. Completing a TCO tool is not a requirement for SACWIS or CWIS, and the jurisdictions can customize this TCO to fit their needs. As Kate mentioned earlier, it's available. It's shared up on the Capacity Building Center website. You can add rows, you can add years, you can, not use as many categories as you see. So fully customizable, but this is just an example. Before we jump into it, I just wanted to orient you to some of the sections that we have. So sections 0 through 7 with, ground zero being agency readiness, and you'll see when we launch it that there are some specific costs around agency readiness, which could be time and effort that the agency undertakes to do business process mapping, to do requirements gathering internally, to think about what reports they need to have supported by the information system. So agency readiness is really ground zero. Then there's personnel and project management costs for actual personnel and staff that will support the project while it's going on, software and hardware, training costs, maintenance costs, and then sort of down from 4 through 7 are post-implementation kinds of support costs. So federal rules change, state rules change, business rules change. Those changes may need to now be impacted to support the end user experience, to support the business process. The system may be expanded. It might take on additional agencies. It might take on additional programs. It might be enhanced. And then there's just contingencies. So what kinds of costs might you can't know exactly what policy change and policy guidance might come down the road, but maybe we want to plan for some post-implementation contingencies. I also want to point out that some states have laws and require that independent verification and validation vendors or project management often vendors need to be used for a large system implementation. Those costs could be in the design, development, implementation phases, but those personnel costs for IV&V vendors or project management vendors, those may or may not be maintained during the maintenance and operations phases. So some of those costs for external vendors to do IV&V and project management might be in phases 1 through 4, but you might not need your project management vendor with you when the system is operational and you're just in a maintenance or change implementation phase. The worksheet, we're going to launch that next, but it will capture costs that are driven by FTEs, so costs that are driven by headcounts, as well as costs that are driven by units or fees. And at this point, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and we're going to plug in a few costs. So hopefully you're looking at an Excel file. There we go. At the very top, there are a few notes that we're not going to, you can all read, but it just says if you need to have different hourly rates for different staff, add rows, add columns, add your assumptions, and then if you're making tweaks to this, make sure you update your formulas from column M over to column Q to make sure you're capturing all the costs that are input on the left side of the screen. So we're going to go through sections like 0, 1, and 2, and then we'll sort of scroll down through the rest of the sections, but we have a few costs that I've done some estimating for. So if you're looking at specifically readiness kinds of costs, so business process mapping perhaps, or cost allocation documentation, or creating new forms, maybe you have one person dedicated to this, maybe they work a third of their time on policy creation, or the forms person might work 3/4 of their time. The hourly cost of this person can range from, you know, whatever it is, $100 an hour, $50 an hour. How many hours they work is based on what their percent FTE is, and then what is their cost. And as you'll see as I scroll, a lot of those costs will be in that first year, although policy and practice process documentation, maybe that blows over into year 2. Maybe practice changes, or maybe you see practice change and process documentation changing in year 3 or year 4. But ideally, a lot of that readiness work is done right up front. There's a section to capture agency readiness. Then you move into direct services costs. Try to do that quickly so it's not so dizzying for you. Direct costs for actually developing the system itself. Contract manager, an internal contract manager, an internal project manager, again, part-time, full-time, one person, business analyst, 2 people, 3 people, technical analysts, subject matter experts. You'll see down here I had an IV&V vendor. The IV&V vendor is going to charge $700,000 a year for this effort, but they're going to only be on board for 4 years. So you'll see those costs. So the cost of your personnel staff, this line is your subject matter expert staff. We had 2 of them. They're very intense in years 1 and 2. They're less intensely involved in years 3 and 4. Then we're going to go down to the software kinds of costs for the case management software. Licensing fees, we'll see there's 120 units. That's just an estimate of the number of end users that might use the system. There's a testing cost, so you can actually buy testing software. So I looked at a cost for a specific vendor's testing software package. It was $14,000. There's a cost for configuration that the vendor might do, so that's actually tweaking their own new implementation code or potentially developing configuration to external interfaces or for external consumption. So there's a fixed cost for configuration. The vendor will develop 20 interfaces at $90,000 a piece, and the vendor might charge a flat rate of $500,000 for data migration, and data migration happens in years 3, 4, and 5 when the system is up and running. And maybe you migrate everything at once in year 3, maybe you migrate everything at once in year 4, or maybe you did data migration over the course of several years. But as you'll see, the goal of looking at the sheet is some costs you'll experience across multiple years, and some costs will sort of ebb and flow based on the system development lifecycle phase that your project is in. The next section around hardware and software, we're going to actually plug in a few different costs. Specifically, we're going to look at the cost of servers. So this assumes that you're doing the on-premises and you are building out your own internal server room, and you're going to buy 4 servers that cost $3,800 a piece, and you need those pretty early in the process because you actually need the servers to be up and running because that's helping to support your environment. And then we're going to purchase some software for virtual machines and database licenses. We're going to purchase 5 of those, and we're going to purchase those up front as well. Then we're going to replace 90 workstations. So up above, we estimated 120 end users, but not everybody needs a brand new laptop, and not everybody gets a brand new laptop in the first year. So those costs are spread over later years. Network charges. So this is a cost that your internal agency charges you a certain amount of, $3 an hour for every terabyte of information that you have. So I worked out that this particular hosting will be $140,000 in total, but spread over $28,000 a year. And then office rent. So this is for an external vendor, but you might have your staff co-located with your vendor. About a $3,000 a month lease, comes out to about $70,000 times for the year, 2.5 offices. So you might build out office space in 2 different locations, or you might build out office space that's small and gets larger. But the office space, as your staff involvement or vendor involvement sort of ramps up and ramps down, you might be able to have smaller office space or renegotiate your lease and only have to support a staff of 12 as opposed to a staff of 40. So those are the costs I want to show. Number one, how these ones are unit driven, which is slightly different from personnel costs, which might be hourly driven. That you see end user costs around things like license fees or workstations and replacements. You would also see end user costs around end user training, and just show that some of the costs are very much upfront and very much sort of front loaded and front heavy, but there's still an ongoing cost to maintain. As we'll scroll quickly down, there's 2 different sections for training, end user training as well as operational support training. So as the IT infrastructure changes, as the application changes, so you now release new functionality in year 4, there's a new program instruction from ACF, and we need to tweak a specific thing in our case management tracking solution, and we need to go in and add a data value. Well, now you want to train your application staff on how to install that new feature, and you might need to go back and train some end users on how that new case management factor is a new piece of your information system. We've already talked a bit about maintenance, help desk, network administration, setting up new users. And then I'm not going to talk anymore about these, but these sections 5, 6, and 7 are all of those changes, expansions, and enhancements. So at this point, I'm going to go back to the slides. I think we have one more polling question. I know you're excited. And then we're going to wrap it up with some final thoughts. So this last one is, please give an example of a cost that is driven by the number of end users. These are all good. Office space may or may not be so much, depending on the number of office space might be impacted by the number of personnel that support it. But as it relates to licenses for all of the applications that are running in your office, or potentially the space that you need to have if you're installing it, building out your program, extending it to different users, potentially you need to think about office space of a certain size to support your specific staffing model. IV&V may or may not be. It's normally not an end user driven. It's more of a fixed cost from a vendor based on the complexity of the project, the duration of the project, and what the requirements are for the IV&V vendor. Everything else, though, licenses, laptops, help desk support, yep, I think that would be, it may not be a one-to-one relationship. Every user needs a help desk person, but if you have 500 users, you should have a help desk of a certain size to support 500 people could call at any given time. These are great answers. End user training, cloud computing could be based on the size and the number of people that are hitting it. So those are good answers. Thank you. And at this point, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Kate, and we're going to give you some additional where to find more information kinds of themes.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So today you saw a lot of really good information about total cost of ownership, system development, and it was a high-level overview and got into some of the details of the spreadsheet and what that looks like. Of course, recognizing every jurisdiction is in a unique place related to system development. We wanted to make sure that you know where to go with further questions and information. And of course, if you have any questions, burning questions at the moment, we would love it if you type it into the Q&A pane, and we'll try to get those answers while everyone's on the line. But so as I mentioned earlier, the materials that you saw today, the workbook, and then also an overview guide are available under the resources link directly on the Center for States webpage. And so we'd encourage you to go and take a look at those, look at the workbook, and think about how you might be able to use it, modify it to your needs. We specifically posted it as an Excel document so that you can customize it, but still have access to the formulas that are already programmed in there. So if you have any questions related to, of course, federal guidance, we've posted the link to the state and tribal assignments for the Children's Bureau Systems, State Systems Analysts. And then also, if you're interested in learning more about support from the Center for States, you can contact your center liaison, and that link is also one of the resources. Find your Center for States liaison. You can contact your regional office specialist, or you can contact me, and we will make sure that you get in touch with the right person or get the information that you are looking for. Okay, so we have a few questions coming in, so we'll go ahead and try to address those. The Agile methodology talks about the cone of uncertainty, and the further out you plan, the more inaccurate you will be.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with the cone of uncertainty, although I guess I can understand what it is. I suppose that means that Agile would suggest that a waterfall method, which gets you multiple years from seeing real-life product, will likely potentially yield something that's not reflective of the current process. So I think that's likely true. Well, I've never heard the term. But Agile, you're developing features and turning on features and functionality as you go, and therefore you don't have to get, so in contrast to waterfall, where you're planning in 2017 what you think your system might need to do in 2020, 2021. So there's the difference of what you plan for in 2017 is perhaps not where you land 3 or 4 years from now when practice changes. So that might be, sort of a nod for Agile. There's benefits to either one. Go ahead, Kate.
I'm sorry, Michelle. There was a second part to that question that I didn't get to. Should we expect the vendors to provide this if fixed price bid?
Provide the methodology? I'm not sure. I know the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, the second part of the question was, what is the margin of error that you predict with this model?
I don't think we actually estimated one. So there is, though, a contingency that there's contingency built into the development side, and there's also contingency built into the post-implementation section 7 and section, I think it's in section 4. So to the extent that you don't know everything you're going to have to do, and you don't know everything that every rule change that might come along in the course of development or maintenance, there is a place for contingency that a lot of projects might maintain 5% or 10% contingency, so you can actually build that into the model for uncertainty. So it could be that it wasn't an error, but it could be that you just had unexpected things come up and you had a budget line item plan for that.
Okay, great, thank you. And actually the one that I mentioned before was the standalone question. Should we expect the vendors to provide this if fixed price bid?
Provide a total cost of ownership?
Yeah, I think that's what it means, provide a total cost of ownership analysis.
Suppose you could. I think it would be reasonable for a vendor to help any buyer understand what they might expect as maintenance costs. So to the extent that, yes, in a bid, in a fixed price bid, you should know implementation for sort of system development. So what are the development costs? What are the interface costs? What are the configuration, the customization costs? And on an ongoing basis, what are the maintenance needs that you would anticipate? Whether you keep the vendor around to do maintenance or you take it in-house, you should have an estimate of how hard is it to build off a new data value or create a new report or add field to a certain screen. So to the extent that they may not know how long you plan to keep the system, but those maintenance costs in the out years 4 through 20, I think it would be important for a vendor to articulate, how many resources are needed to make a system change, how easy it is to add fields, reports, or values, and that could drive what you think your cost would be for the ongoing maintenance phase. But I think it would be hard to know for anyone what changes might be, in the out years related to policy. Hence, the contingency might be important. I think I see one. Do agencies underestimate report development needs, or how to get actionable data out of the system once it's up and running? Would you recommend including cost estimates for that? So there's there's two different places for report development needs. So there's report writing as a planning function up front. So how many reports do you as a jurisdiction know that you need for CFSR, for legislative folks within your own jurisdiction, for AFCARs, et cetera. So you know your reports, you know the reports you've been creating, you know the reports that you struggle to provide every month or every quarter. So absolutely, I think agencies underestimate, what reports they might need. So again, contingency might be helpful, but also getting the information out of the system could be a requirement of your vendor from, you have to build X number of interfaces, you have to build X number of reports, you have to leave us or do knowledge transfer for how to build custom reports. So I think to any extent that you can estimate fixed amounts of reports, expected amounts of reports, which might be contingency, and then maybe a vendor has to help you understand or give you a toolkit of how do I build my own reports that are ad hoc, or, just once a year I have to do something. Give me some knowledge transfer, give me a user guide or some other type of assistance so that you can provide, produce that report yourself. That would be my advice. Kate, I'd love for you to weigh in on that one too.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and to make sure to consider subject matter expertise and communication feedback with the field as well when you're thinking about things that are going to come up, whether through some guidance that comes in or a change in the practice model or implementation of a new practice or initiative. I don't see any other questions coming in at the moment. Okay, great. Well, yep, no more questions. Oh, sorry, one moment. Looks like one just came in. CWIS requires a data quality practice. How do you recommend costing that process? Okay, and we heard from Teresa Young, who said that that's a good question for the CWIS mailbox. So we'd encourage you to submit that question to the CWIS email, and we'll try to provide that before the end of the webinar and post it so that you can have access to that and ask that question. And I believe, as far as I can see, that's the last question that's come in. Okay, great. Okay, and we're in the process of getting that email address posted in case you don't have quick access to it. So I think we can move on in the slide. Okay, so just to kind of wrap things up, we would really appreciate your feedback about this webinar, and also any other information that would help the center improve future programs, webinars, products, and that sort of thing. So we'd really like to hear from you about any of those things, any ideas that you might have, or suggestions. We definitely take that information consider it very important, and use it to plan our future events. You're also going to receive an email within 24 hours with a link to provide that feedback. Okay, and I see that the email address has been posted in the Q&A pane if you need that. And with that, we just want to thank you so much for joining us. We provided email addresses for myself and for Michelle if you have specific questions as you start looking at the workbook, or have any other thoughts or ideas about those products or other areas of support, or if you're interested in learning more about the other services available from the Center for States, including tailored services. So our email addresses are up there. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you here on future events.